August 15th. The day the Japanese Empire surrendered. Across Tokyo, crowds filled the streets, their faces tilted upward as static-filled radios carried the trembling voice of Emperor Hirohito. The war was over at least. That was the promise echoing through the air. People wept openly, some with relief, others with despair. For them, history had pivoted in an instant, from the rhythm of bomb sirens to the silence of an uncertain peace, but far from the neon glow of Tokyo's lamps, far from the clamor of radios. Another world endured. In the bamboo-framed huts of Luzon, in the sticky jungles of Burma, in the back alleys of Nanjing, silence reigned, not from celebration, but from dread. In one particular hut, deep in the Philippines, the smell of mildew and sweat clung to the air. Thin paper screens rattled in the humid wind. And there, a group of women sat motionless, barely more than shadows, holding on to one another as if they were planks of wood adrift at sea. They had no idea that Japan had surrendered. No one had told them the emperor's words, nor would they have believed such words if whispered. Their world was defined not by international treaties, but by the scrape of boots on floorboards, the bark of Japanese sergeants, the sound of doors sliding open. To them, time had narrowed into a single expectation: another night, another round of soldiers, another day of survival. The place had been given a gentle name by the occupiers, a comfort station. The phrase, almost merciful in its vagueness, disguised a reality that was brutal beyond measure. This was not comfort. It was a prison without bars, a machine designed to consume human dignity and leave behind nothing but compliance. These stations were not isolated accidents of war. They were deliberate, planned, spread like stains across Asia, wherever the rising sun flag flew. Shanghai, Rangoon, Seoul, Manila. For years, the Japanese Imperial Army had transported and confined women, forcing them into a system so vast that its true scale is still debated. Some scholars estimate 50,000 captives. Others argue it was closer to 200,000. Imagine stadiums filled with women, each one stripped of her name, her freedom, her youth. Inside this hut in the Philippines, two of them sat close. One was just 17. She had been taken from her Korean village 2 years earlier, promised factory work. Instead, she found herself on a transport ship, then marched into this station, where her name was replaced by a number scrawled in a ledger. She bit her lip until it bled, clinging to fading fragments of her mother's lullabies. She feared not death, but forgetting the sound of home. Beside her was another captive, older by a few years, though malnutrition etched deeper lines across her face. She was Filipina, taken after Japanese troops swept through her village in 1942. She remembered hiding in tall grass with her younger brother, only for bayonet tips to flash above them. He had been killed on the spot. She had been dragged away. Now her body was a commodity, her memories the only possessions left unrecorded. She kept her eyes lowered, for even eye contact, whether with guards or fellow captives, could invite punishment. The rules of the station were shouted in Japanese: obedience, cleanliness, availability. Doctors arrived weekly for humiliating inspections. Soldiers filed in by the dozen, each woman enduring 20 or more visits on long nights. Disease spread quickly. Refusal was unthinkable. The women had been conditioned into silence, their voices suppressed as thoroughly as their freedom. They lived in the cruel paradox of surviving the war while being treated as its most expendable casualties. And outside, history thundered forward. American bombers incinerated Tokyo in March. Atomic clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Hirohito's voice announced surrender. The empire was collapsing. Yet inside this hut, none of that mattered. Here there were no radios, no celebrations, no fireworks in the night sky, only the groan of doors, the hiss of lamps, and the dread that another set of boots might scrape across the threshold. The Japanese guards abandoned their posts days before. Some vanished into the jungle. Others surrendered. Yet for the women left behind, this was not liberation. Abandonnement mont exposure. Who would find them now? Would it be worse men? Strangers who knew nothing of them beyond their vulnerability. Rumors seeped through the cracks like smoke. Americans were near, for women who had endured years of degradation at the hands of one army. The idea of another army inspired not relief, but terror. Soldiers were soldiers. Uniforms, no matter their color, meant ownership, meant power over the powerless. Whispers circulated in the darkness. Some claimed the Americans were giants who smoked cigars and laughed as they killed. Others repeated the words of Japanese officers, who painted the enemy as even more barbaric, eager to desecrate any woman they encountered. The irony was bitter. These women were already enduring the very horrors their captors accused others of. But fear does not measure irony. Fear measures survival. As dusk settled, shadows stretched long across the floorboards. The cicadas outside droned, then faltered, as if the jungle itself held its breath. Inside, the women huddled closer. The younger clutched the older. The older clutched no one. The Korean girl pressed her nails into her palms until crescents of blood bloomed. She thought of her mother's market stall, of roasted chestnuts, of the smell of soap. She thought of soldiers' hands and braced for more. And then engines rumbled in the distance. Boots approached, but these boots were heavier, slower, their rhythm unfamiliar. The women froze. The air thickened. The door slid open. Silhouettes filled the frame, broad shoulders outlined against the fading light. Uniforms. Again, in that instant, one truth became undeniable. For these women, the war had not yet ended. It was about to take a new, unexpected turn. The story of the comfort stations does not begin in 1945. To understand what those women endured in the bamboo huts of the Philippines, we must step back to the 1,930 seconds, when Japan was not yet defeated but ascendant, hungry for empire and desperate to keep its war machine disciplined. The system of comfort women, or ienfu in Japanese, emerged not from accident, but from deliberate planning. After Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its escalating war with China in 1937, military leaders faced a problem that has plagued armies throughout history: how to control the violence of their own soldiers. In occupied Chinese cities, mass rapes like those in Nanjing sparked global outrage and fueled resistance movements. The Japanese High Command feared two things: international condemnation and unrest among the troops if soldiers spread disease or turned their aggression on the local population unchecked. Their solution was chilling in its simplicity: create a system of state-sponsored brothels, staffed not by volunteers, but by women coerced, deceived, or outright kidnapped from across Asia. Soldiers would be funneled into these stations as if into barracks, each woman reduced to a numbered entry in a ledger. In this way, sexual violence was not just tolerated but bureaucratized, engineered into the very structure of the Japanese war effort. This was not new in the history of warfare. Armies throughout time, from the Romans to Napoleon's Grande Armée, left trails of sexual violence in conquered lands. But what set Japan apart was the industrial scale and organization of its system. Where others allowed brutality to unfold chaotically, the Japanese military mechanized it, building a network of comfort stations across every territory they occupied. Shanghai, Rangoon, Manila, Seoul, Nanjing, even remote islands in the Pacific. Wherever the rising sun flag was planted, the stations followed. The numbers alone are staggering. Historians debate whether the total was 50,000, a conservative estimate, or closer to 200,000. As some survivors and scholars argue, most were Korean, roughly 80 to 90%. According to wartime Allied reports, others were Chinese, Filipina, Taiwanese, Indonesian, Burmese, Dutch. Nationality offered no shield. Age did not protect them either. Survivors recall being as young as 13 when taken. Recruitment often began with deception. Japanese agents or collaborators promised jobs in factories, restaurants, or hospitals. Young girls, eager to help their families or escape poverty, signed contracts or boarded ships, only to discover too late their true destination. Others were seized outright, dragged from villages after massacres, or arrested under false accusations. Once in the system, there was no exit. The women's names were erased, replaced with numbers. Their bodies became commodities measured not by humanity, but by efficiency. The operation ran with chilling precision. Doctors inspected the women weekly, not for their health, but for the Army's. Venereal disease was the enemy, not suffering. Ledgers recorded each soldier's visit, payments collected by officers or contractors. The Japanese military insisted the system preserved discipline and prevented worse atrocities. In truth, it was an atrocity in itself, one that turned women into raw material for war. As essential to the empire as steel or coal, to grasp the scale of this crime, one must place it within the broader tapestry of Japan's wartime brutality. The same empire that forced women into sexual slavery also conscripted millions of men into mines and factories, shipped Koreans and Chinese as forced laborers to Japan, and experimented on prisoners through Unit 731's grotesque biological warfare programs. In every case, the logic was the same. Human beings were expendable resources, tools to be consumed for victory. And yet, the comfort women system had a unique cruelty for the women trapped within it. The war was not fought on battlefields, but in the confines of dimly lit rooms, on stained mattresses, behind reed mats. Battles elsewhere were measured in miles gained or bombs dropped. Here, survival was measured in how many soldiers one endured in a single night, in how long one's body could withstand exhaustion, disease, and humiliation. As the empire expanded, so did the stations. By 1942, after Japan swept through Southeast Asia, the system had reached its widest extent. Filipino women were seized after villages were burned. Dutch women in the East Indies, taken from internment camps, were forced into comfort houses. Taiwanese and Indonesian girls, some still in their early teens, were funneled into the same machine. The cruelty was not just physical but psychological. Survivors speak of losing their sense of identity, of forgetting the sound of their mother tongues because Japanese orders drowned out all else. They were conditioned to silence, punished for speaking, forced to submit until even resistance became unthinkable. And yet, paradoxically, the system was largely invisible to the outside world during the war. Allied soldiers knew little of its existence until the tide turned in the Pacific. It was only as American forces advanced across islands and into Southeast Asia that they began to stumble upon these huts, hidden in jungles and villages, remnants of a system designed to be both ubiquitous and secret. This background matters because it reveals the scale of the betrayal when Emperor Hirohito's surrender was announced. For civilians in Japan, the words meant relief, survival, an end to air raids. For soldiers, it meant defeat. But for women trapped inside these stations, the war's end was irrelevant. Their tormentors had built a world within a world, one where peace treaties and surrender broadcasts held no sway. Even after the guns fell silent, they remained prisoners, conditioned to expect boots at the door. And so, when the Japanese fled and the Americans drew near, the women did not feel liberated. They braced for another chapter of the same horror. What awaited them, however, would defy both their fears and their imaginations. To understand the moment of liberation, We must first dwell inside the suffocating walls of the comfort stations themselves, the daily reality that shaped every heartbeat. Every thought of the women trapped there. The huts were small, flimsy things, often bamboo frames with paper or thin wood for walls. Yet their fragility was deceptive, for inside them, the atmosphere was ironclad with rules and repetition. Every detail of life was regimented. The women were woken at dawn, ordered to wash themselves, sometimes with little more than buckets of cold water. The rules shouted in Japanese by guards were few but absolute: obedience, cleanliness, availability. Failure meant punishment, often beatings, sometimes worse. The ledger controlled their lives. Each woman was a number. Soldiers would queue outside, their visits recorded with the efficiency of a factory. Payment was exchanged, not for the women themselves, but for the system that claimed them. Coins clinked into boxes, receipts filed away. Behind each mark in the ledger was a body enduring yet another violation. On long nights, some women were forced to service 20, even 30 soldiers. Others collapsed mid-act, only to be beaten awake and forced to continue. One Korean girl, just 17, sat in the corner of one such hut. She pressed her lips together until they bled, trying to hold on to memories of her village. The sound of her mother's voice, the rhythm of lullabies sung over rice paddies. She had been told she was going to work in a factory, a chance to support her family. Instead, her name had been stolen, replaced by a number. Her greatest fear, she later recalled, was not death, but forgetting home, forgetting who she had been. Near her sat a Filipina woman, perhaps 23. Though malnutrition carved years into her features, she had been taken in 1942 when Japanese troops swept through her village. She remembered hiding in the tall grass with her younger brother. She remembered the glint of bayonets, the shouts in a language she barely understood. And she remembered the moment her brother fell, stabbed before her eyes. She was dragged away that same day, carried into the machine that would reduce her to an entry in a ledger. Now she stared at the floorboards, knowing that even eye contact, whether with guards or fellow captives, could invite violence. Disease stalked the rooms like a second enemy. Venereal infections spread rapidly. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Medical inspections were weekly humiliations, with doctors examining the women not for their sake, but for the army's. Soldiers could not be incapacitated by illness. The women's pain, however, was irrelevant. If one was too sick to work, she was often beaten or replaced by another conscripted girl. Psychological torment layered upon physical exhaustion. Silence became their survival. Speaking out invited punishment. Questioning rules invited blows. Even gestures of kindness among themselves were dangerous, for guards often interpreted solidarity as resistance. And so they clung to small fragments of humanity in secret humming lullabies, whispering prayers, clutching one another in the dark. Outside, the world was shifting. Allied forces were closing in. Bombers reduced Japanese cities to ash. Atomic mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito's voice trembled over the radio, conceding defeat. But these women had no radios. They did not know the empire had fallen. For them, the cycle of boots, shouts, and violations continued as if history itself had forgotten them. Then, a strange change. The Japanese guards disappeared. Some fled into the jungle. Others surrendered quietly. At first, the women were relieved, but quickly, relief curdled into dread. Abandonment was not freedom. It meant vulnerability. Without guards, the station was no longer a prison controlled by one army, but a ruin that could be seized by anyone. And rumors spread like wildfire. The Americans are coming, one whispered. The words carried no comfort. For women who had only known cruelty in uniform, another army was simply another predator. Whispers painted the Americans as towering brutes who smoked cigars, laughed while they killed, and defiled women as ruthlessly as their enemies. Some Japanese officers had deliberately spread such tales, fueling terror that would outlive their own presence. The irony was cruel. The very men who had enslaved these women had convinced them to fear rescue even more. Inside the huts, anxiety thickened. Women huddled together in silence, clutching one another as though preparing for another storm. The younger clung to the older. The older clung to no one. The cicadas outside droned, then faltered, as if nature itself sensed the shift. For the Korean girl, every approaching footstep was a trigger. She pressed her nails into her palms, drawing crescents of blood. She thought of her mother's market stall, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the warmth of soap, and she thought of the endless parade of soldiers, preparing herself to endure again. Her body had been trained to expect one cycle only: boots, commands, survival. Then came the sound, the heavy rumble of engines in the distance, the rhythm of boots, unfamiliar yet unmistakable, drew closer. The women froze, every muscle tense. The door slid open. Silhouettes filled the frame, broad-shouldered figures outlined against the fading light. Uniforms. Again, uniforms. And in that instant, every woman in the hut understood the truth. The war had not yet ended for them. Whatever came next, they braced to endure. The women braced for impact. They had lived too long under one army's cruelty to expect anything different from another. Uniforms meant domination. Boots meant commands. The doorframe filled with shadows, and their bodies stiffened for what they were sure was the next wave of ownership. The figures stepped inside. These men were taller, broader, their movements heavy but unhurried. The language spilling from their mouths was unfamiliar, harsh consonants, foreign rhythms. English. To the women, the words carried no meaning. Tone alone mattered. And at first, even that felt dangerous. One of the Americans barked something toward the others. The women flinched, but instead of advancing on them, the men set down the crates they carried. The sound was strange. Wooden slats thumping against the floor. Another soldier pried one open. Instead of weapons, inside were tins round, metallic, glinting in the dim light. The scent of syrup and fruit filled the air. Peaches, the Korean girl, who had pressed her nails into her palms until blood rose, stared blankly as one of the tins was placed in her hands. She did not reach for it. She had been trained not to reach. Instead, the soldier gently pressed it into her palms, curling her fingers around the cool metal. For the first time in years, something was being given to her, rather than taken away. Her body trembled. The Filipina woman beside her was handed a bar of soap. White, solid, wrapped in paper. The smell struck her like lightning cleanliness. Dignity. Humanity. She clutched it to her chest as though it were treasure. Tears welled, though she had not cried in years. The soldiers were clumsy in their kindness. They did not know what to say, nor did the women understand their words. But gestures crossed the gulf between captor and captive. A canteen of water was offered. The spout tilted carefully so it did not spill. A blanket draped over thin shoulders. None of it erased what had happened, but each act chipped away at the terror that had calcified inside the women. And then came something unthinkable. One soldier, red-haired, with freckles faint even under the grime of war, pulled a harmonica from his pocket. He raised it to his lips and blew. Music, soft and uneven, filled the hut. It was not military commands, not shouted orders. It was melody. Fragile, hesitant, but melody nonetheless. The women froze again, but differently this time. Some closed their eyes. Others pressed their palms to their faces. For years, sound had meant fear, the scrape of boots, The slam of doors, the guttural language of commands. Now, sound meant something else entirely, something without violence. The astonishment was unbearable. For women conditioned to expect cruelty, even clumsy kindness felt overwhelming. They could not yet trust it. They hoarded the food as if it might be snatched back, hid the soap as though it were contraband. Every gesture of compassion seemed fragile, temporary, ready to vanish. Liberation was not instant. It was a fragile negotiation between memory and reality. But in that room, for the first time in years, mercy entered. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but undeniably. The Americans, untrained in how to handle such survivors, relied on instinct: feed them, clothe them, comfort them, and though they did not know it, their very restraint was revolutionary. For women who had known nothing but ownership in uniform, the absence of violation was itself a revelation. The hut, once a prison, filled with strange contradictions. Relief mingled with disbelief. Gratitude warred with suspicion. Tears flowed not from joy, but from the unbearable weight of realizing they were no longer prey. Outside, the world was moving quickly. Treaties signed, prisoners released, soldiers demobilized. But inside that bamboo hut, history shifted in a quieter, more intimate way. The women learned, tentatively, that uniforms did not always mean cruelty, that not every bootstep carried violence, that perhaps, after years of silence, their bodies might once again belong to themselves. It was not freedom complete. Traumalinge. Scars remained. But in that moment when a tin of peaches was pressed into a trembling hand, when soap sparked tears, when a harmonica broke the silence, the war, in its own small way, finally ended for them. Liberation did not mean peace. For the women of the comfort stations, freedom was not a door that swung open in triumph, but a slow, uneven crawl back toward dignity, one that left many permanently scarred, and most forever silent. In the days immediately after their discovery, American medics did what they could. The women were treated for infections, malnutrition, and physical injuries. Reports from U.S. Army doctors noted not only the ravages of disease, but something harder to name: psychic shock. The survivors flinched at sudden noises, avoided eye contact, hoarded food even when supplies were abundant. They clutched soap, tins of fruit, blankets as if these small items might evaporate. To the Americans, it was clear. These women were not civilians in need of evacuation alone. They were survivors of a system few in the outside world had even imagined. Some soldier wrote letters home describing comfort girls. Though the term often flattened their suffering into rumor or curiosity, the reality was more severe than even many rescuers understood. When the women returned to their homes, those who could relieve quickly gave way to new forms of anguish. Families, instead of embracing them, often recoiled. In Korea, survivors were branded as dishonored, unfit for marriage, reminders of national humiliation. In the Philippines, communities shunned them, seeing them as tainted by association with the occupiers. In China, silence was the only survival strategy. To speak out risked shame, not only for oneself but for one's entire family. Many carried their secret until death. The trauma was twofold: first, the years of enslavement, then the lifetime of enforced silence. Liberation had freed their bodies, but stigma imprisoned their voices. Justice, too, was elusive. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, the comfort women's system was mentioned, but it was never the centerpiece of prosecution. The crimes of aggressive war, of mass killings, of prisoner abuse, all these dominated the courtroom. The suffering of the women remained peripheral, overshadowed by atrocities that were easier for male judges and prosecutors to categorize. It was not until decades later that the world would begin to recognize the scale of this crime. In 1991, a Korean woman named Kim Hak-soon broke the silence. Then in her 60s, she publicly testified about her life as a comfort woman, the first to do so openly. Her voice shattered the decades of denial. After her, hundreds of others came forward, each testimony a crack in the wall of silence. Their courage forced historians, politicians, and international courts to confront what had been hidden. The consequences rippled outward. In the 1,990 seconds, survivors organized protests in Seoul, Manila, and Taipei. They demanded not only recognition but apology. Weekly demonstrations outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul continue to this day, each Wednesday marked by elderly women, some in wheelchairs, raising their voices against the silence that once consumed them. Globally, their testimonies reshaped how the world understood wartime sexual violence. The term comfort women entered the lexicon of international law, not as euphemism but as indictment. Their stories influenced the United Nations' recognition of rape as a weapon of war, a crime against humanity. They laid the groundwork for prosecutions decades later in places like Rwanda and the Balkans, where sexual violence was finally treated not as incidental but as systematic. The women's suffering, once hidden, became central to the modern conversation about war crimes. Yet their fight for justice remains unfinished. Some Japanese leaders have acknowledged the system, others have denied or minimized it. Apologies have been offered, then retracted, then offered again in forms that survivors often found hollow. Even today, textbooks in Japan sometimes downplay or omit their stories, a silence that echoes the post-war years. But for those who survived, memory itself became resistance. Every testimony, every protest, every tear shed in public was a defiance of the shame forced upon them. They had been reduced to numbers in ledgers. Now they were names, faces, voices that refused to vanish. And all of it began in those bamboo huts, where liberation first came not in the form of treaties or tribunals, but in the awkward kindness of strangers. Soap, peaches, a harmonica's tune, small acts that showed the women something they had been taught to doubt, that dignity could be restored, even in fragments, even in whispers. For history, the comfort women system is a case study in how far cruelty can be mechanized. But for the survivors, its legacy was not abstract. It was the battle to live after the war, to insist on being heard, to reclaim a humanity denied for too long. Their suffering reshaped international law. Their silence reshaped post-war societies, and their eventual voices reshaped memory itself. The war had ended in 1945. But the struggle for recognition, like their scars, would last a lifetime. The war ended not with silence, but with a voice, Emperor Hirohito's surrender, trembling over the airwaves on August 15th. Itenjobasishu marked an official close to hostilities. Cities erupted in celebration. Prisoners of war stumbled out of camps, finally free. Families reunited after years of dread. But in the bamboo huts of the Philippines, in the dim rooms of Nanjing, in the wooden barracks of Korea, liberation was something quieter, stranger, more fragile. For the women known as comfort women, freedom came not with flags raised or treaties signed, but with soap pressed into palms, with tins of peaches opened clumsily by foreign hands, with the unexpected mercy of music on a harmonica. Those moments mattered precisely because they were small. For years, every gesture they had known was one of cruelty boots scraping, fists striking, commands shouted. To receive kindness, however awkward, was to experience a world turned upside down. It did not erase what had been done. It did not heal the wounds carved into their bodies and minds, but it created the possibility of imagining life beyond survival. And yet, history's cruelty continued in quieter forms. When the women returned home, Many were met not with sympathy but with shame. Families whispered, communities recoiled, nations, struggling to rebuild, preferred silence to confrontation. For decades, their stories remained buried beneath stigma. They had endured enslavement and war, and silence in peace. But silence is never permanent. In 1991, when Kim Hak-soon stood before microphones and told the world what had happened to her, she broke open the dam of memory. Her voice carried the weight of all those who had died without speaking, and all those still alive, but too afraid to say the words aloud. From that moment on, the world could no longer look away. Today, statues stand in Seoul, Manila, and beyond bronze effigies of young women seated in quiet defiance. Empty chairs beside them, inviting passers-by to sit and remember. Each Wednesday in Seoul, survivors and their supporters gather outside the Japanese embassy, holding signs, demanding acknowledgement. Their numbers grow smaller each year as age claims them, but their persistence ensures their voices will not fade. The story of the comfort women is not just about cruelty, it is about memory, dignity, and the strange paradox of war. In the same conflict that produced atomic fire and massacres without number, there were also moments when humanity flickered against all odds. A soldier offering fruit instead of violence, a bar of soap received with tears, a harmonica breaking a silence once filled only with commands. These contrasts do not balance each other. Kindness does not erase atrocity, but they remind us that history is not only what was done, but also what was withheld. Mercy, recognition, justice, and the absence of those things can wound just as deeply as violence itself. As we reflect on the story of the comfort women, we are left with a question. What do we owe to those whose dignity was stolen in the shadows of war? The treaties are long signed, the generals long buried, the empires long gone, but the memory remains. And memory is not passive, it is responsibility. If mercy could exist in those huts in 1945, if kindness could break through the thick walls of cruelty, then the least we can do today is carry those memories forward, to speak their names, to tell their stories, to refuse silence, because history is not only about the victors, nor only about the crimes, it is also about the voices that refuse to disappear. Even when the world told them to be silent. Soap, peaches, a harmonica's tune. These were the first fragments of freedom. The rest is up to us.